Chief Researcher Zix-427 adjusted their crystalline, sensory appendages as they stood before the Galactic Science Coalition's High Council. Their iridescent forms sparkled under the chamber's bioluminescent lighting, a trait their species exhibited when experiencing absolute certainty. Today's presentation would change everything. They were sure of it. Distinguished members of the Council, Zix-427 began, their voice resonating through the chamber's perfect acoustics. For too long, we have allowed an egregious error to persist in our scientific databases. The classification of Earth's wildlife as extreme danger, approach prohibited, is nothing more than the result of poorly documented research and exaggerated folklore. A murmur rippled through the assembled council members. Representative Mornine, a gaseous entity contained within an environmental suit, condensed slightly, their species equivalent of a concerned frown. Need I remind you, Chief Researcher, that we have lost 17 expedition teams to Earth's wildlife in the past solar cycle alone? With all due respect, Representative, Zix-427's crystalline structure pulsed with barely contained excitement. Those teams were using outdated methodologies. My team has developed revolutionary containment technology. Observe. They activated a holographic display showing various Earth creatures, carefully curated to appear harmless. Look at this specimen, they continued, displaying footage of a sleeping koala. These creatures spend 22 Earth hours in a state of near unconsciousness. Or this one, the image shifted to a grazing deer, a herbivorous quadruped that flees at the slightest disturbance. These are the creatures we're so afraid of. Professor Voidex, a being composed entirely of dark matter, spoke up. You seem to be showing us rather selective footage, Chief Researcher. What about the documented incidents with the species known as geese? Statistical anomalies, Zix-427 dismissed with a wave of their crystalline appendage. My team has developed state-of-the-art containment fields, observation drones, and protective equipment. We've even created a new classification system based on our preliminary remote observations. The holographic display shifted to show their new system, which categorized Earth's wildlife from harmless to mildly inconvenient. Notably absent were any categories suggesting actual danger. High Counselor Eternal, an ancient energy being who had personally witnessed 3 planets destroy themselves, leaned forward in their containment chair. And your team, Chief Researcher. Who are these brave souls willing to test your theories? Zix-427 brightened literally, their crystalline form now glowing with pride. I've assembled the finest xenobiologists in the galaxy. Dr. Quantum 6, specialist in predator psychology. Professor Helix, expert in defensive adaptations. And our field leader, Commander Vex, veteran of the Razor Beast expeditions on Nexus Prime. The same Commander Vex who declared the Razor Beasts basically oversized kittens right before they devoured their containment ship. High Counselor Eternal's energy form flickered with what might have been amusement. Commander Vex has learned from that experience, Zix-427 insisted. We've studied every previous expedition's failures and developed countermeasures for every conceivable scenario. The council chamber fell into a deep silence, the kind that usually preceded either a groundbreaking decision or a catastrophic mistake. Finally, High Counselor Eternal spoke, their voice carrying the weight of eons. First contact gone wrong. The research vessel, Empirical Truth, emerged from hyperspace just outside Earth's atmosphere, its adaptive camouflage rendering it invisible to terrestrial detection systems. Inside the ship's main laboratory, Commander Vex was conducting final equipment checks while trying to ignore Chief Researcher Zix-427's endless stream of excited commentary. Just look at these readings. Zix-427's crystalline form sparkled with each exclamation. The preliminary scans show absolutely no signs of organized resistance from the wildlife. This will be the easiest expedition of our careers. Commander Vex, whose cybernetic implants still ached from their last easy expedition, merely grunted. They had chosen a landing site in what Earth's inhabitants called Central Park, reasoning that any wildlife in the middle of a human city must surely be domesticated and harmless. Dr. Quantum 6, their predator psychology specialist, was reviewing footage from their advanced probes. Their tentacled form writhed with scientific excitement. Fascinating. The small furry creatures appear to be soliciting food from humans. Clear evidence of domestication. Professor Helix, who had been quietly running threat assessments, raised a concerned appendage. Shouldn't we be worried that they've managed to train humans to feed them? Nonsense. Zix 427 dismissed the concern. It merely proves their dependent nature. Now let's begin with specimen collection. Commander Vexed, deploy the containment drones. The drones, gleaming spheres of advanced technology, descended from the ship's bay. Each was equipped with state-of-the-art containment fields designed to safely capture and transport wildlife specimens. They had been tested extensively on the most dangerous creatures from 17 different worlds. They lasted exactly 6 minutes and 43 seconds on Earth. The first drone approached what their database identified as a squirrel. The small creature sat perfectly still, clutching what appeared to be a food item, as the drone activated its containment field. Then, with remarkable precision, the squirrel threw its acorn directly into the drone's primary sensor array. Fascinating. Dr. Quantum 6 exclaimed. Tool use. Wait. Commander Vex leaned forward. Why are all the squirrels now holding acorns? Before anyone could respond, the air was filled with flying acorns. Each one somehow found a critical weakness in the drone's construction. As the research team watched in horror, their million-credit containment devices were reduced to scattered parts by a coordinated squad of squirrels. Perhaps, Professor Helix suggested dryly, we should try a different location. They relocated to what their maps identified as Canada, choosing a serene forest clearing for their next attempt. A large, peaceful-looking creature stood in a nearby pond, methodically chewing on aquatic plants. Perfect. Zix 427 exclaimed. A herbivorous quadruped, completely focused on feeding. Deploy the backup drones. Commander Vex hesitated. The creature matches database entries for moose. There's a warning flag on the file. More paranoid classifications. Zix 427 dismissed. Look at it. It's eating plants. The moose looked up from its meal, fixing the drones with a stare that somehow conveyed both intelligence and irritation. What followed would later be described in the mission report as technically impossible according to known physics, as the moose demonstrated exactly why Canadians give these creatures such a wide berth. Fascinating. Dr. Quantum 6 shouted over the sound of drones being transformed into abstract art. It appears to be using the trees as projectile weapons. That's not physically possible. Zix 427's crystalline form had taken on a distinctly pale hue. Trees don't bend that way. Someone should tell the moose that, Professor Helix observed, as they watched their backup drones join their primary drones in the great scrapyard in the sky. As the team retreated to their ship, they received an incoming transmission from the Galactic Science Coalition. How goes the research? High Counselor Eternal's voice carried a distinct note of amusement. Minor setback, Zix 427 reported, trying to maintain their dignity. We're adjusting our approach. However, I should note that the wildlife appears to have some unexpected problem-solving capabilities. Oh, the High Counselor's energy form flickered. Do tell. Well, Commander Vex interjected. We've confirmed that squirrels understand ballistics, moose can rewrite physics, and we're down to our last set of drones. And you've been there less than one Earth day, the High Counselor noted. Impressive. Perhaps you'd like to reconsider. Absolutely not. Zix 427 interrupted. These are merely unexpected variables. We simply need to adjust our methodology. In fact, we've already selected our next research site. The local databases describe it as perfect for wildlife observation, someplace called Australia. The silence from the High Council was deafening. "We'll prepare more obituaries," High Councillor Eternal finally said, and terminated the transmission. The Australian incident. Preliminary scans show no signs of large predators, Dr. Quantum 6 announced as the empirical truth hovered above the Australian outback. Their tentacles were wrapped around multiple sensor arrays, each feeding data into the ship's analysis systems. Just some small bouncing herbivores and a few scaled reptiles. Commander Vex, still nursing their pride from the moose incident, examined the landscape below through enhanced viewing ports. The red earth stretched out beneath them, dotted with scattered vegetation and what appeared to be peaceful wildlife. "Why does this make me more nervous than the moose?" "Your paranoia is showing again, Commander," Zix 427 chided, their crystalline form glowing with renewed confidence. "Look at those creatures." They gestured at a group of kangaroos grazing peacefully below. "They're practically walking food processors. What could possibly go wrong?" Professor Helix, who had actually read the complete Earth Wildlife database, was frantically trying to compile a warning report. "Chief Researcher, I really think we should review the historical data on this continent. We're not going to let outdated reports cloud our judgment," Zix 427 interrupted. "Deploy the reinforced containment drones." The new drones, hastily constructed from the ship's spare parts and optimistic thinking, descended toward the group of kangaroos. They were equipped with enhanced protective fields that theoretically could withstand impacts from creatures 10 times their size. Theory, as it turned out, had never met a kangaroo. The first drone approached what appeared to be an elderly kangaroo, moving slowly to avoid startling it. The kangaroo watched it approach with what the team would later swear was a smirk. As the drone activated its containment field, the kangaroo casually raised itself onto its tail. "Fascinating posture adjustment," Dr. Quantum 6 exclaimed, recording frantically. "Perhaps a defensive stance." The answer came in the form of a kick that somehow bypassed the containment field entirely, sending the drone into a trajectory that defied several laws of physics. The remaining kangaroos, apparently taking this as their cue, began what could only be described as a choreographed demonstration of drone destruction. "How are they coordinating their attacks?" Commander Vex demanded, watching as their reinforced drones were systematically reduced to scrap. "They're using advanced combat formations." "Perhaps we should try a different specimen," Zix 427 suggested, their glow notably dimmer. "Something smaller, less athletic." That's when they noticed the platypus. "Perfect." Zix 427 brightened. "Look at it. It can't decide if it's a bird or a mammal. How dangerous could it be?" Professor Helix's warning was cut off by the deployment of their last drone. The platypus, which had been peacefully paddling in a small pond, turned to face the approaching device. Its expression, if one could call it that, suggested it had been waiting all day for this moment. What followed would require the invention of several new scientific terms to properly describe. The drone sensors recorded the platypus executing what appeared to be a combination of advanced martial arts, chemical warfare, and probability manipulation before they abruptly stopped recording anything at all. Did it just use venom?" Commander Vex asked weakly. "Since when do mammals have venom?" "Since Australia," Professor Helix muttered, finally pulling up the warning report they'd been trying to share, along with spiders that hunt birds, snakes that chase cars, and birds that start fires. "They what?" Zix 427's crystalline form had taken on a distinctly clouded appearance. Their discussion was interrupted by a new alert from the ship's sensors. Something was approaching from the nearby trees, something that moved with purpose. "Analyzing life form," Dr. Quantum 6 announced, their tentacles working frantically across the sensor arrays. "Small marsupial. Primarily carnivorous. Local designation, drop bear." "That doesn't sound so bad," Zix 427 said hopefully. The next few minutes would prove to be educational for everyone involved, particularly in terms of understanding why the local humans had tried to warn them about looking up in the eucalyptus trees. The drop bears, it seemed, had not only mastered the art of ambush, but had somehow developed an understanding of spacecraft weak points. As they made an emergency ascent, pursued by what Professor Helix would later describe as gravity-defying combat marsupials, they received another transmission from the Galactic Science Coalition. Having fun. High Counselor Eternal's voice was heavy with sarcasm. We're conducting valuable research, Zix 427 insisted, though their voice lacked its usual confidence. We've discovered that Earth's wildlife has developed unprecedented combat capabilities, including what appears to be tactical coordination, and they were interrupted by a thump from the ship's hull. What was that? Commander Vex asked, checking the external cameras. The cameras showed a cassowary, somehow keeping pace with their spacecraft at an altitude of several thousand feet, methodically dismantling their sensor array with its claws. Fascinating, Dr. Quantum 6 exclaimed. It appears to have mastered both flight and tool use simultaneously. That's not fascinating, that's impossible, Commander Vex shouted, initiating evasive maneuvers. Welcome to Australia, Professor Helix sighed, already drafting their resignation letter, where the wildlife treats physics more like guidelines than actual rules. As they finally broke atmosphere, leaving the cassowary to return to whatever laws of nature it had decided to ignore that day, High Counselor Eternal's transmission crackled back to life. Perhaps, they suggested mildly, you'd like to reconsider your classification system. Absolutely not, Zix 427 declared, though their crystalline form was now vibrating with what might have been fear. We still have one more research site to investigate, a place the humans call Florida. The collective groan from the Galactic Science Coalition could be heard across 3 star systems. The Florida frontier. The empirical truth hung in low orbit above the Florida Peninsula, its hull still bearing scorch marks from their hasty retreat from Australia. Inside, the research team was conducting what they optimistically called a strategic reassessment, and what any reasonable observer would have called a group panic attack. The good news, Commander Vex announced, reviewing their severely depleted inventory, is that we've still got one functional drone left. The bad news is that it's technically just 3 broken drones duct taped together. Fascinating material, this duct tape, Dr. Quantum 6 mused, their tentacles prodding at a roll of the silver substance they'd salvaged from a human hardware store. Perhaps the only Earth technology that actually exceeds our own. Chief Researcher Zix 427, their crystalline form now displaying stress fractures, was trying to maintain their optimism. Florida represents our last chance to prove our hypothesis. The local wildlife here seems much more manageable. Professor Helix, who had been analyzing the local ecosystem, suddenly emitted a high-pitched warning tone. Chief Researcher, you might want to see this data on the local reptilian population. No more negativity. Zix 427 interrupted. We simply need to choose our research subject carefully. What about those large, docile reptiles basking in the sun down there? They're practically stationary. The image on the main screen showed several alligators lounging peacefully by a golf course water hazard. They looked, as Commander Vex would later note in their report, suspiciously innocent. Beginning descent, Commander Vex announced, their cybernetic implants registering several warning signals that they chose to ignore. Deploying our last drone, which I've named Bad Idea for the record. The drone, held together by hope and duct tape, wobbled its way toward the nearest alligator. The creature opened one eye lazily, assessed the approaching technology, and appeared to yawn. See, Zix 427 brightened literally, complete disinterest. Finally, a properly behaved Earth creature, the alligator moved with speed that their sensors initially registered as a measurement error. The drone, despite its enhanced reflexes, never stood a chance. What made it worse was the look of smug satisfaction on the alligator's face as it returned to its sunbathing spot, now decorated with scattered drone parts. Did it just? Dr. Quantum 6 consulted their readings, Calculate the exact force needed to dismantle our drone into its component parts. Look on the bright side, Professor Helix offered. At least it didn't eat the duct tape. Their momentary relief was interrupted by a new alert from their perimeter sensors. Something was approaching the ship. Multiple somethings. What are those? Commander Vex asked, enhancing the external camera feed. Local designation: Florida Man. Professor Helix read from their database. Warning: approach with extreme. Oh no. The group of humans below had noticed their ship, despite its supposedly perfect camouflage, and were approaching with what appeared to be golf clubs, lawn chairs, and an unreasonable amount of enthusiasm. Fascinating, Dr. Quantum 6 exclaimed. They appear to be attempting first contact using recreational equipment as ceremonial objects. Those aren't ceremonial objects, Commander Vex corrected, watching as one of the humans successfully used a golf club to hit a beer can directly into their primary sensor array. Those are weapons. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The Florida men, displaying what the team's sensors described as physically impossible levels of coordination, while simultaneously appearing completely uncoordinated, began a systematic attack on their ship. What made it worse was that the local wildlife seemed to be helping them. The alligators are hurting us, Commander Vex shouted, executing evasive maneuvers as several large reptiles somehow coordinated a pincer movement. Since when do alligators understand tactical warfare? The sensors are detecting more incoming threats, Professor Helix reported. Local designations: Florida Panthers, showing unusual problem-solving abilities. Mosquitoes, displaying swarm intelligence. And, is that a manatee with a rocket launcher? That's impossible, Zix 427 protested. Manatees are peaceful aquatic herbivores. And where would it get a rocket launcher? Florida, Professor Helix replied simply, as if that explained everything. And somehow, it did. The next few minutes would later be classified as too improbable to be included in official records. The Florida men, now riding alligators like battle mounts, coordinated with the local wildlife in ways that defied both physics and common sense. The manatee's rocket launcher skills proved surprisingly accurate. As they executed an emergency ascent, pursued by what appeared to be a python piloting a stolen airboat, they received one final transmission from the Galactic Science Coalition. Having fun? High Counselor Eternal asked, their energy form flickering with what was definitely amusement now. We're leaving, Commander Vex announced before Zix 427 could respond. New classification. Earth's wildlife is not just dangerous. It's actively conspiring against us. Don't forget the humans, Professor Helix added, watching as a Florida man successfully lassoed one of their stabilizer fins with a fishing line. They're not just cooperating with the wildlife. They're enabling it. Fascinating theory about human-wildlife cooperative behavior, Dr. Quantum 6 exclaimed, still taking notes even as their ship spun wildly. Although I must point out that the manatee's targeting skills suggest previous experience with advanced weapon systems. Not the time, Commander Vex interrupted, executing a maneuver that finally broke them free from the fishing line. Setting course for Coalition space at maximum speed. As they fled Earth's atmosphere, they could have sworn they heard cheering from below. The Florida men were celebrating their victory, the alligators were looking smug, and the manatee was calmly disassembling its rocket launcher while a python offered tactical advice. I may have been slightly optimistic about Earth's wildlife classification, Zix 427 admitted, their crystalline form now displaying the cloudy appearance of deep humiliation. You think? Commander Vex replied, checking their ship's systems. We've lost 3/4 of our equipment. The hull is dented in ways that shouldn't be physically possible, and I'm pretty sure that Manatee just added us to its contact list. At least we gathered valuable data, Dr. Quantum 6 offered cheerfully. For instance, we now know that Earth's wildlife not only understands advanced technology, but sometimes improves upon it. Did you see what that alligator did with the duct tape? Never speak of Florida again, Zix-427 commanded, their glow completely dimmed. New classification recommendation. Earth is to be avoided at all costs. Not because of danger, but because nothing there makes sense. As they limped back to Coalition space, their ship held together largely by duct tape and regret, they received one final message from Earth. It was from the Manatee, sending a friend request on Galactic book. The final report. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Science Coalition was packed to capacity. Scientists from across the galaxy had gathered to hear what was being called the most expensive wildlife study in Coalition history, though mostly because of the insurance premiums. Chief Researcher Zix-427, their crystalline form now permanently clouded with humility, stood before the assembled crowd. Behind them, Commander Vex was still picking duct tape off their cybernetic implants, while Dr. Quantum Six's tentacles were excitedly organizing their presentation materials. Professor Helix sat quietly, updating their resume. High Counselor Eternal's energy form pulsed with barely contained amusement. Please begin your report, Chief Researcher. We're all eager to hear about your reassessment of Earth's wildlife classification. Zix-427 cleared what passed for their throat. Distinguished colleagues, we stand before you today to present our findings on Earth's wildlife and to propose a new classification system that more accurately reflects our observations. The holographic display activated, showing their ship's remnants, now more duct tape than actual spacecraft. Several audience members winced. Our first finding, Zix-427 continued, their voice wavering slightly, is that Earth's wildlife demonstrates unprecedented levels of intelligence, coordination, and what can only be described as a disturbing sense of humor. Dr. Quantum Six excitedly waved their tentacles. The data suggests that Earth's creatures have not only adapted to their environment, but have developed advanced strategic thinking. For instance, observe this footage of squirrels executing a perfectly choreographed drone destruction sequence. The assembly watched in stunned silence as the recording showed their million-credit drones being systematically dismantled by acorn-wielding rodents. Note the precision. Dr. Quantum Six enthused. The targeting algorithms. The small victory dances. Commander Vex stepped forward. Our second finding is that Earth's wildlife appears to operate under its own set of physical laws. We documented several instances where creatures simply decided that physics was more of a suggestion. They played the footage of the Australian incidents, carefully edited to remove their screaming. The kangaroos demonstrated advanced combat formations. They explained, pointing to a sequence that looked more like a martial arts demonstration than wildlife behavior. The platypus showed mastery of what we're calling tactical improbability. And the drop bears, well, we're still not sure how they reached our ship at that altitude. Professor Helix activated their portion of the presentation. But perhaps most disturbing was our discovery in Florida, where we observed unprecedented levels of cooperation between local wildlife and humans. The assembly gasped as they showed footage of the Florida men riding combat-trained alligators. Several senior scientists had to be escorted out when they reached the part about the manatee with the rocket launcher. Of particular note, Professor Helix continued, is this graph showing the correlation between human presence and wildlife behavior complexity. It appears that Earth's creatures become more intelligent and more chaotic the more they interact with humans. Fascinating implication. Dr. Quantum Six interrupted. The humans aren't domesticating the wildlife. They're teaching them advanced warfare. High Counselor Eternal leaned forward. And your final conclusion, Chief Researcher. Zix-427's crystalline form pulsed with resignation. We propose a new classification for Earth, reality optional zone, approach at own risk. We recommend that all future studies be conducted via long-range observation only, preferably from another solar system. And the wildlife danger classification. The High Counselor prompted. We had to create a new category, Zix-427 admitted. above extreme danger and below just run. We're calling it deliberately messing with you. The presentation concluded with their revised classification system, which included new categories such as deceptively adorable, physics optional, and Florida, the last being its own separate category with multiple warning symbols. High Counselor Eternal's energy form sparkled with satisfaction. Well, Chief Researcher, it seems you've made quite the discovery after all, though perhaps not the one you expected. Indeed, Zix 427 agreed mournfully. We also recommend updating our scientific methodologies to include a new axiom. If an Earth creature appears harmless, it's because it hasn't decided to harm you yet. The Assembly voted unanimously to accept their findings, with several addendums including never trust a platypus, and Florida is to be studied only via theoretical mathematics. As the team left the Assembly Hall, they received one final message on their communicators. It was from the Florida Manatee, sharing photos of its new rocket launcher collection on Galactic. Somehow, it had gotten better reception than their ship's communication system. You know, Dr. Quantum 6 mused, their tentacles thoughtfully stroking their data pad. We never did figure out how that manatee got our contact information. Some questions, Commander Vex replied, applying fresh duct tape to their cybernetic implants, are better left unanswered. Back on Earth, the wildlife continued their daily routines. The squirrels held advanced ballistics classes, the kangaroos refined their combat formations, and somewhere in Florida, a manatee was teaching a python how to pilot a submarine. The planet's creatures had a reputation to maintain, after all, and the next alien research team would be arriving any day now. As for the duct tape the aliens had left behind, the raccoons were already reverse engineering it. They had some improvements in mind.